The call came from a payphone on a street corner in Los Angeles. It was 3 in the morning. The number was untraceable. Michael Jackson picked up and recognized the voice immediately. The History World Tour was in its final months. It was the autumn of 1996, and Michael Jackson had been on the road for almost a year. 80 cities, 4 continents, the kind of schedule that made the concept of a private life feel theoretical. He was staying at a rented house outside London when the call came through on a private line that very few people had. His security team noted the incoming number and flagged it. Payphones were treated as unknown contacts, and unknown contacts were logged. Michael took the call in a room by himself. He was on the line for 37 minutes. When he came out, he said nothing about who he had spoken to. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down at the kitchen table, and stayed there for a while with a very specific kind of expression. The expression of someone who has just been reminded of something they already knew, but had forgotten how to feel. Nobody in the room asked who had called, but 3 days later, someone did trace the number. The payphone was located on a street corner on Mulholland Drive, 2 miles from Marlon Brando's house. To understand what that friendship was, you have to understand what 1996 meant for both of them. Marlon Brando was 72 years old. He had been, at different points in his life, the most celebrated actor in the history of cinema and the most ridiculed figure in Hollywood. He had won 2 Academy Awards and refused both of them. He had been written about, psychoanalyzed, imitated, parodied, and mythologized by people who had never met him, and he had responded to all of it with a ferocious, lifelong refusal to be understood on anyone else's terms. Michael Jackson was 38 years old. He was in the middle of the most publicly scrutinized period of any artist's life in the history of entertainment. Everything he did was watched. Everything he said was analyzed. Everything he didn't say was assigned meaning by people who had never spoken to him. The 2 men had met years earlier at a private dinner in Los Angeles. The people who arranged the introduction had expected a formal, brief encounter between 2 celebrities navigating the same industry. What happened instead was a 4-hour conversation that ended only because the staff of the restaurant asked them to leave. Neither of them had spoken about it publicly. That was, in itself, the first sign that what had passed between them was something neither one was willing to expose. What drew Marlon Brando to Michael Jackson was not immediately obvious to anyone watching from outside. They were different in almost every visible way. Different generations, different disciplines, different public identities. But Brando had a quality that very few people ever developed: the ability to see clearly what fame did to a person from the inside. He had lived it himself since he was in his mid-20s. He had watched it consume people he cared about. And in Michael Jackson, he saw something he recognized with complete precision. Not the spectacle, not the music, not the controversy. He saw a person who had never been given the opportunity to develop privately, who had been a public figure since childhood, and for whom the concept of an unobserved self had never fully existed. Brando had written in his memoir that the most dangerous thing about fame was not what it did to your ego. It was what it did to your sense of what was real. He believed Michael Jackson was navigating that danger with a kind of courage that almost no one around him could see, because they were all too close to the spectacle to understand what it was costing him. The payphone calls had started sometime in 1994. Brando's idea, Brando's ritual, Brando's terms. The payphone was not a precaution Marlon Brando took lightly. By the mid-1990s, he had spent decades developing a specific and comprehensive distrust of surveillance, of phones that could be monitored, of conversations that could be recorded, of words spoken in private that found their way into print. He had been betrayed by people he trusted. He had been misquoted by people who had taken notes. The payphone was, for him, the last genuinely private communication technology available to a person of his visibility. He used specific ones he had identified over years of walking the streets of his neighborhood late at night when no one was watching. He would call from different phones on different nights, never the same one twice in a row. Michael Jackson, who had his own history with surveillance and with conversations that had been recorded without his knowledge, understood the instinct completely. He kept a private line, separate from his management systems, separate from his security team's logs, for a very small number of people. Brando's calls came in on that line. For almost 3 years they spoke regularly, once a week, sometimes more. And for almost 3 years, nobody on either side knew it was happening. What made the autumn of 1996 different from the months that had come before it was not any single event. It was the accumulation. The History Tour had been running since September 1996. The press coverage had intensified with every leg. Stories about Michael's physical condition, his mental state, his private life, all of them circulating simultaneously, each one feeding the next. Michael had stopped reading the coverage months earlier. But stopping the reading did not stop the awareness. It did not stop the feeling of being discussed in a language that had nothing to do with his actual experience of being alive. Brando had called on a Tuesday night. He hadn't called to discuss any specific piece of coverage. He hadn't called to offer advice or strategy. He called because he knew, from his own experience, that there was a specific kind of week, a week when the accumulated weight of public existence pressed harder than usual, when the most useful thing another person could do was simply be present on the other end of a line. He had learned that from years of being on the wrong end of it himself. The call lasted 37 minutes. What Brando said in those 37 minutes was something Michael would not forget. Marlon Brando had a specific way of talking about fame that was unlike anything Michael Jackson had encountered from anyone else in his life. He didn't treat it as an achievement or a burden or a responsibility. He treated it as a condition, like a climate you lived inside, that shaped everything without being the thing itself. He told Michael that the mistake most famous people made was trying to manage their public image as if it were a separate entity, something that could be controlled, shaped, directed. He said, "The image was never yours to begin with. It belongs to the people who built it. Fighting it is like fighting the weather. What you protect," he said, "is the interior, the part that the image can't reach, the part that knows the difference between what is being said about you and what is actually true." He told Michael that he had spent years getting that wrong, confusing the attack on the image for an attack on the self. And he said that the cost of that confusion was something you only understood once you had paid it. Michael listened without interrupting. He said at one point only, "I think I've been paying it." Brando was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I know. That's why I called." 3 days after the call, a member of Michael's security team ran a routine check on all incoming numbers from the previous week. The payphone number had been logged, as all unknown numbers were, and the trace came back to a specific corner on Mulholland Drive. The team noted its proximity to Brando's property and brought it to Michael's senior advisor. The advisor went to Michael directly. Michael's response was brief. He said, "Yes, don't log those calls." And that was the end of the conversation. Within Michael's inner circle, the knowledge spread quietly. Nobody spoke about it publicly. Nobody leaked it to the press. Partly because Michael's team understood discretion. It was a fundamental requirement of working in his orbit. But partly because the friendship, once known, was immediately understood. The two most isolated men in Hollywood, one at the end of a career, one in the middle of the most turbulent stretch of his, speaking once a week on payphones because it was the only way either of them could be certain nobody was listening. It made a particular kind of sense that required no explanation. The calls continued. In 2001, Marlon Brando appeared in the music video for Michael Jackson's "You Rock My World." It was the first public acknowledgement of a friendship that had been running, in private, for the better part of a decade. People in the entertainment industry noticed. Very few of them knew what it meant. Brando didn't do music videos. He hadn't appeared in a commercial project of any kind for years. The people who asked him why received answers that were characteristically oblique. Deflections dressed as explanations, which was Brando's standard response to any question he found too direct to answer honestly. The real reason was simpler. Michael had asked him, and Brando had said yes because he had spent 7 years watching Michael Jackson be publicly misrepresented, and appearing in the video was one of the few ways available to him to say, without saying it, "I know who this person actually is." On the day of the shoot, the two of them sat together between takes and spoke for a long time in a corner of the set. Nobody recorded what was said. But people who were present that day said that watching the two of them together was unlike watching any other two famous people in a room. There was no performance between them. Just two men who had, against considerable odds, learned to trust each other completely. Marlon Brando died on July 1st, 2004. He was 80 years old. Michael Jackson did not give a public statement. He did not attend the memorial. He did not speak to the press. The people around him in the days that followed described him as quieter than usual, not visibly grief-stricken in the way that was legible to the outside world, but carrying something that was visible only to those who knew him well. A stillness that was different from his ordinary stillness. One person who was close to him during that period said that Michael had made one comment privately in the days after Brando's death. He said, "He was the only person who never asked me to be anything other than what I was." That sentence, which was never intended for public consumption, contained something that years of coverage and biography had never quite captured. The specific texture of what Michael Jackson needed from the people in his life, and how rarely, in 45 years in the public eye, he actually received it. Brando had given it to him on payphones at 3 in the morning from street corners on Mulholland Drive. For almost a decade, and it had been enough. There is something in this story that resists the categories the entertainment industry uses to describe itself. It is not a story about fame, exactly. It is not a story about music or film or the collision of two legendary careers. It is a story about what two people found in each other that they could not find anywhere else. Recognition. The specific, rare recognition that comes from being seen by someone who has lived inside the same impossible condition, who knows what it costs and who does not require you to perform your survival for their benefit. Marlon Brando called from payphones because he understood that what he had to offer Michael Jackson was only valuable if it was completely private. The moment it became observable, the moment it could be watched, reported, analyzed, it would stop being what it was. He protected the friendship the same way he had learned over 7 decades to protect the few things in his life that actually mattered, by keeping them out of the light. Michael Jackson spent most of his life in the brightest light imaginable. Brando gave him a phone call in the dark, once a week, for almost 10 years, and Michael answered every time. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to this channel. Every week we bring you the moments behind the music that history almost forgot. Share this video with someone who understands what it means to have one person who sees you clearly. And leave a comment. Who is the person in your life that calls when nobody else does? Michael Jackson's story is not just about talent or spectacle or controversy. It is about what every human being needs, and how hard it can be to find it when the whole world is watching.